All right, let's go. Mr. Burns, how are you?
Oh, well, Mr. Sinners, we're back. Bit of budgetary policy.
Back for budget 2016 and 17.
Love a bit of fiscal policy. What about you?
Good. Yeah, I do. And I'm not kidding. Now, why have you got Uncle Joe there on the right-hand side?
Well, I just thought we shouldn't forget old Uncle Joe. He's over in America enjoying his time over there. And
smoking a cigar or two.
And trying to avoid catching a taxi because he's having a few troubles at the moment with regards to the cab charge fiasco. But it's all relevant. You can, students, use, in all seriousness, use budgetary examples from the past 4 years if they refer to recent budgets. So Uncle Joe brought in a few interesting budgetary policy initiatives. 2014 budget that got through the Senate.
Some of them got through, many of them didn't. So it's probably best not to use the ones that did not get through the Senate. That is the
spot on.
Most notably the doctor co-payment for Medicare co-payment. And
probably not a good idea to mention it if they're not going to use it. Because
should we start the video again?
No,
we'll just move on. Right. So what is fiscal or budgetary policy?
Right. Well, it is the using the budget to smooth out the cyclical variations in economic activity. It's one of the macroeconomic theories. Obviously, in Unit 4, we're talking about macro or demand management, macroeconomic demand management, and the budget is able to impact upon the economy and try and smooth that trend line out through its impact upon economic growth and activity. Keynesian economics from John Maynard Keynes.
Yeah, and when we come to talk about the policy mix, that'll include monetary policy and how they both operate at both the peak and the trough. And you will have heard about how, and in your classes, about discretionary and automatic stabilisers and how they occur in the budget at different times, whether you're at the budget is whether the economy is in a trough or in a peak.
Yeah, and the idea is, obviously, students, the budget should be operating in a counter-cyclical fashion. Should be. Make note I mentioned that. We're in a counter-cyclical fashion, so we have an expansionary budget when we're in a recession or in a slowdown, and we have a contractionary budget when we're in a peak or a boom. And the idea is that over the business cycle or the economic cycle, we will end up with what's called fiscal balance, where the deficits and the surpluses occurring at those two times will even out.
Okay.
Right.
So, what are we going to talk about? Revenue.
So now we're going on to the mechanics of the budget, if you like. So where does the government get its money from? And clearly company tax is a key source of government revenue. It really is important, students, you understand the different types of taxes that are in operation. Progressive, regressive, proportional, direct, indirect, how they fit, what they mean, able to explain them clearly, and their relevance with regards to raising revenue. Any comments there, Mr. Smithers?
No,
you don't pay a lot of taxes?
No, I pay my fair share of tax.
Still getting that middle class welfare?
I'm still getting a little bit of middle class welfare, but not a hell of a lot. And that's something that we can talk about if we're talking about the structural issues with the budget.
Company taxes, an example of?
A proportional tax, and as opposed to some of the indirect taxes as GST and excise taxes, which are regressive in nature. And we've seen, and we'll probably refer back to the cigarettes excise tax, which my class have been doing a lot of work on.
Your class is doing some work.
Yeah, well, some.
There he is, ScoMo, up in the corner.
He's
taking in the money. He's loving it, isn't he?
Yeah, so first...
He's pretty pumped about the economic data that came out yesterday.
Pumped or pissed, anyway. So
I don't think you can say that on the video, can you?
Well, he looks like he's had a couple anyway. Perhaps he's got a very smug look about him. So what we noticed there is our revenue comes in at about 417 billion. And
wouldn't mind a piece of that.
Predominant form of government revenue is individual income tax, of course, our progressive tax system, as we just talked about different types of tax. Company tax is one of the other big earners for the government, as is sales tax. The government has about 90% of its revenue from taxation, about 10% from non-taxation sources such as profits from GBEs or sale of assets. And are we talking about headline and underlying later? Or?
We can talk about that now.
All right. So, of course, students, you should know the difference between headline and underlying in terms of the budget outcome. And the headline rate is the final rate, but the underlying balance takes out sales of assets, such as Telstra back in the good old days when they...
Commonwealth Bank in the 80s. Did you get a piece of that?
No.
$50 they floated for, Commonwealth Bank.
Didn't get any of that.
85. It was a very good investment at the time.
So the sale of those assets, while it does go into government coffers and government revenue, and Howard and Costello used the sale of Telstra, I think, to pay down international debt.
Absolutely. And the Future Fund.
And to develop the Future Fund. That, of course, is an asset that can't be resold the following year. So it's a one-off. And that's why that is not included in the underlying figure of the budget outcome.
Very good. We've only got Australia Post left, really, to sell, haven't we?
Medibank, have they sold Medibank yet?
Oh, they're talking about it. I don't know. Expenses. Moving on. Where's the money go? There it goes. Goes to you and your middle-class welfare.
Me, yeah, I get some of it.
I know.
No doubt.
How's that work? You've got a good accountant, obviously. You're part of that tax evasion, that crackdown on tax avoidance.
Oh, if we only had an extra half hour to go into your finances and your tax minimisation scheme.
Right, expenses. Let's move on. The pension is obviously a growing and key area of government expenses. And it is actually, I read somewhere, and I think this is right, don't quote me on it, students, but my understanding is the aged pension is the single largest expense item in the budget. Social welfare obviously incorporates another disability pension, unemployment benefits, Mr. Smithers, family tax benefits, all those sort of things are part of social welfare. But the pension is one that's growing fast and is a concern.
Well, it's big and growing fast, of course, because of the ageing population, something you guys should be well aware of.
And, of course, other government services, key expense there, cigars for treasurers and finance ministers.
Who are these people? All right, for those who said Joe Hockey and Matthias Cormann,
you get a tick.
You get extra marks. All right, so here are the expenses pie, and that social security that Mr. Burns was talking about, pensions are the biggest part of that, but of course there's unemployment and disability payments and some middle class welfare, which is possibly part of the structural issues to do with the budget.
And health too, students, don't forget, health is a big part, and growing as well. Pharmaceutical benefit scheme, Medicare, big debate in the moment about the freeze of the Medicare rebate. There are good reasons why the government's doing that, but it is politically unpopular, and this gets into the strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy. But you could argue that is funding Medicare something that we can continue to do, and if we are going to continue to fund free healthcare, then we may have to pay high taxes. But it doesn't appear as though they seem to get that. I'm not quite sure.
and basically the freeze is a higher tax because people will end up having to pay more money to see a doctor as the doctor's costs of operating those services goes up. So that is something that hurts equity, that particular policy.
And the other key expense items, obviously education and defence. So they're the key ones to pick up on, and other purposes, obviously cigars and cab charges.
All right. Now, the budget stance versus the budget outcome. Now, one thing that students quite often get confused is this idea of stance and outcome. So the theory tells us that if you have a deficit, you're in an expansionary phase. But if your deficit is being reduced, as we see from last financial year to this financial year, even though it's only a tiny reduction, it's actually slightly contractionary. Why is that, Mr. Burns?
Because they're taking more money out of the economy next year, if you like. It's a plan than they put in the previous year. So we're reducing the amount of money in the economy by roughly $2 billion. So it's mildly contractionary, almost neutral is the terminology I'm using in class. It's certainly not expansionary, although there are some specific measures, and this gets to the structural component later on, that you could argue are sort of stimulatory of themselves. But its macroeconomic impact upon the total economy will be mildly contractionary or almost neutral, given the deficit is being reduced only by a small amount.
Okay, and I think it's worth noting that as we look forward to what their future plans are, and of course this relies on forecasts that end up being a little pie in the sky out here at 2019-20, but they are, aiming clearly to reduce the deficit to a much more manageable figure, as is their goal of fiscal balance over the course of the business cycle. So we've had, I think, 9 or 10 years of deficits.
I think the next slide a bit later on looks at the deficit.
Right. Now,
a bit later.
regarding the deficit, given that we have had 9 and 10, we've got to look at how to fund the deficit.
Yes.
And I think when you see, this is what I'm talking about here, is this area here, which is deficits. This dotted line is where we're at the moment. And obviously they don't plan to close that gap until 2019-20, even into 21. So, how do we fund the deficit? Well, there are 3 ways to fund the deficit. Borrowing overseas has been a popular one.
It has borrowing international financial markets, borrowing domestically, which generally tends to crowd out private investment expenditure, and then printing money, which is what the Americans have done for a while.
Quantitative easing.
Highly inflationary, although in a period of deflation,
Not a bad idea.
possibly not a bad idea.
So it may be something that the Reserve Bank looks at. I think they're holding off on
They certainly are. Yeah.
looking at it at the moment, but it's
Helicopter money they're talking about.
not to be dead. What's helicopter money?
Well, basically, it's like a helicopter hovering above the economy and dropping the money. And monetarists believed in helicopter money and dropping money out of the sky to try and stimulate economic activity and growth. So it's effectively a euphemism for printing money. But the way the Australian government funds their debt is by borrowing from international financial markets, or borrowing on financial markets, which Australian banks are part of, but then they raise that money overseas as well. So.
And we need to be cognizant of the fact that that's going to impact NFD,
Yes.
and it's going to impact the CAD through net primary income.
That's right, through
So-
interest repayments.
And we're hoping, or we're assuming you will gather that information and be able to make those connections, as we've given you enough, practice questions on that sort of thing. All right. So net foreign debt, we're going to look at that in a little more detail, and the rise of net debt and interest payments. And
really good slide, this one. Thanks, Mr. Prince. I think put this one together for us, didn't he?
good on you, Princey.
Yes, come to the party. As you can see, the red here is the actual dollar figure, and we don't forget, students, we were in a surplus for a while a few years ago, which meant that Commonwealth net debt was totally paid off, and then we built up a number of future funds and different funds, which we put that money into as a sort of savings or buffer. But then since the global financial crisis, we've seen a significant increase in net. Don't forget, this is Commonwealth debt. This is government debt. As a percentage of GDP, it's risen. Opportunity cost of higher levels of debt is you have to pay interest on that debt. But this leads into that question: is debt bad? Is all debt bad? Are these bad numbers? Should we be concerned as a nation about these numbers?
Well, it depends what the debt's being used for.
Uh-huh.
So if we're using them for small little tax cuts, then yeah, it's probably not great debt. But if the government's borrowing money to invest in infrastructure and future, aggregate supply growth in our economy, to provide essential services and amenities.
Well, I think it's away from essential services, more about enhancing the productive capacity of the economy in the future. So the idea would be if we're using the debt to fund increased productivity, increased productive capacity, expanding our PPF, then it's good debt. It makes sense.
Especially in times of very low interest rates around the world.
Good point. If we're using it, as you said, to simply fund middle-class welfare, to provide tax cuts, to meet our ongoing payments, such as pensions and welfare and health, that's a real concern, because you can't borrow forever. Just like I said to Scuderi, however many times will people lend him money? They will stop at some stage. And that's what will happen to Australia if the money isn't being used to generate future incomes.
All right. Good discussion. Now, automatic and discretionary stabilisers. We did touch on this in the earlier graph, and I think your class done it to death. We
have done it to death. I'm still not concerned they get it, but anyway, that's probably my fault, not theirs.
So here we come to look at the automatic and discretionary stabilisers, and the big question in our economy at the moment is that, given the growth figures that came out yesterday, given that our growth and trend growth are not too far apart, why do we have such a deficit problem? And this was the question that my students tried to grapple with this morning in period 1. and yours had a crack at it too, did they?
Yes, they did. No, we did. We talked about cyclical and structural deficits, or cyclical stabilisers versus structural stabilisers. And the thing to pick up on here, students, is that cyclical is the impact of the economy on the budget, whereas structural is the impact of the budget on the economy. And if you understand that statement, you pretty much you're on the way to understanding what we mean by cyclical versus structural deficit. I like this cartoon because one of the things that's driven a bit of a cyclical hole in the budget, has been the end of the mining boom and the profits that are no longer coming to the mining sector, which means the taxes are no longer coming to the federal government. And yes, when Peter Costello was Treasurer, he made some, he oversaw significant budget surpluses and paid down Australia's net Commonwealth government net debt. But at the same time, he was Treasurer at a period where we had record high terms of trade, and money was just dropping on him through the roof, literally. So you could argue that he was Treasurer at a very, very lucky time. And since then, we've seen that mining boom end and those commodity prices end, and the consequences of that are declining company tax revenue, which has led to a structural cyclical deficit.
Yeah, and the structural problems that occur with that is that the changing of the settings from that time when Howard and Costello decided that they would give tax cuts, which, of course, no government would turn around because it would be political suicide. And we see that that's causing, what we currently can refer to as a revenue problem.
Yeah, and you might remember they froze the excise indexation of petrol, which was a political decision at the time because petrol prices were out of the roof, so they froze that. That's cost the budget billions over the last 10 years.
And that was to appease the National Party. And another political constraint is that we have a national Liberal coalition, and then that was to appease their partners, the national partners in that coalition. So again, we're getting into weaknesses here, as well as the fact that there is a structural deficit. And the way to fix a structural deficit, the most obvious way is to raise taxes, and no political party is proposing that. And when they do, they get shouted down, such as the proposed increase in the GST.
Now, on that though, there was, and one policy you can use, moving into discretionary policies, our next slide, don't forget there was a temporary budget deficit repair levy introduced in 2014, was that right?
Yes, by Hockey.
By Hockey, which was an increase in taxes on high-income earners of an extra 2 cents, I think. And the federal government, current government, has decided to remove that, whereas the Labor Party has said they'd keep that. But that is a policy you could refer to if you've got scope in the question as an example of a discretionary policy to reduce the budget deficit. It raised several $1 billion over its lifetime.
Yeah, and it hit the top earners, so it was just over 150.
So hitting you and your family. Moving on. Current discretionary policy.
I think Mr. Burns got that one a little wrong. So
Google Docs. I said refer to Google Docs on this slide. Why did I say that?
You said that because Mr. Burns and I were very impressed with some of the work we saw yesterday when we went off-site, and we decided to have a good look at everyone's policies, discretionary policies, mostly from the current budget, which is great. And you've done a good job. We've edited slightly, and we've put that document up on Connect for you guys to have a good look at and really get a good understanding of the current budget and its impact on different economic goals, as well as overall on the macroeconomy.
And the tobacco excise one, students, is a really good one. It might relate directly to a goal, but you can talk about equity and those sort of things. But it's a really good one for resource allocation efficiency and negative externalities, market failure, those sort of things. And I was listening to the Trade Minister on the radio this morning, Steve Chobo, I think his name is, and he was saying that his argument wasn't stacking up brilliantly, but he was saying that if you want to cut expenditure activity on an area, raise taxes, and he referred to the tobacco excise and alcohol, saying we want people to consume less of these products, we put taxes up on these things, and our argument is that we want to increase company investment, so we've cut company taxes to stimulate company investment and get companies expanding, and that's his argument for jobs and growth. So,
all right,
that's one approach.
So these are just four that we've chosen to put into our PowerPoint, but there are many more in the papers that you've collected, and many more in the Google Docs document that is available on Connect for in this week, starting the 30th of May. So let's move on. Let's have a look at the.
Now, I'd like to, Sarah Hanson-Young, I'd like to interview you on the superannuation changes coming up, or Julie Bishop did a really good job of this on the radio the other day.
Yeah, well, I'll do about it probably as good a job as Julie. But basically, the super changes, what they try and do is stop superannuation becoming a tax dodge for the highest income earners. So there's a super cap of 1.6 million.
This ScoMo there with it in his hand.
And you no longer get the 15% tax applied to you when you go over that amount. Is that?
That's effectively, it's a concession. It's a change, and it's still very concessionally
doesn't concern me,
advantageous.
But you've got 1.6 million.
I wish. But it's also, so I think, students, from your perspective, there are changes to superannuation. All you really need to know is that it's reducing the tax advantages of superannuation for a small number of people, particularly high income earners. So you could use this as a discretionary policy initiative for equity, because it doesn't hurt low income earners. That would be something you might want to pick up on.
Yep, very good. Okay, effectiveness of budgetary policy.
Well, this is one of my favourite little cartoons. This one.
It's pretty complex for a Year 12 student, I would have thought.
Well, it's complex for me. One of the key things about budgetary policy is that, yes, it's a macro tool, but it also has a capacity to target particular areas of the economy. And clearly we've got some things happening in the Australian economy at the moment that are a bit of a concern. Deflation, as we've said, slowdown in economic growth from China, potentially, and overseas growth in our key export markets slowing. We saw that with the GDP figures that came out yesterday. Whilst exports are incredibly strong and contributing to GDP, the income we're receiving from them has been falling, and that's creating a bit of a concern. Oil glut and a number of other issues here. I mean, it's a really, if you can, students, if you can look at this cartoon and what you're seeing makes sense in that little cartoon, we'd be really pleased with that. I guess that's a challenge for you.
Yeah, and it may be worth just in the lead up to the SAC, us pulling this one out and having a look at it, and having a look at the interesting way in which that Nicholson, the cartoonist, has combined the turn back of the boats with trying to fight off some of these challenges that are occurring in the economy, which are hurting the budget bottom line, and which they're trying to aim at with some of it with regards to the budget.
Because Morrison obviously was the immigration minister at the time, before he became treasurer.
All right, now we've got basically the weaknesses of budgetary policy. I know that I always come back to this one being the greatest weakness of all, and this is the fact that there's short-term political machinations with every budget, particularly this one, because the budget is occurring about 8 weeks ahead of the election, which is a very close run sort of time frame, and you don't always get great economic decisions in a budget due to the fact that there's a short-term nature of the political cycle.
One of the think tanks put out a paper a couple of years ago saying the budget should be taken out of politics, out of the government, and handed to independent people that should set tax rates. And
a bit like the RBA.
A bit like the RBA, the independents. And it would remove the politics out of the budget and leave it as a really effective macroeconomic policy tool.
Well, as long as Solis likes on it, Kimmy, I'd be happy with that.
I'm sure he'd be happy with that too. But a key weakness, and here you can talk about things like getting it through the Senate. Whether you believed in the policy changes or not from 2014, they did not get their policies through the Senate because of the balance of power in the Senate. So that's a key weakness of budgetary policy. The other weakness, as Mr. Smith has pointed out, was that it's influenced by the NIMBY concept, the self-interest of different groups. And at the moment, the high-income earning superannuants are screaming like they've been stuck with a knife because they're finding that they're being targeted in this budget. They believe targeted unfairly. Most people believe that it's actually fair. But they are certainly jumping up and down. Even, I think Arthur Sinodinos was on the radio the other day saying they might look at changing, or the implementation of the policy might be different once they get elected. So they're trying to placate that part of their political group or political supporters.
That they don't really need to worry because those political supporters aren't going to go anywhere else.
Well, they're still in the right wing in pretty safe seats, I would have thought.
Yes, exactly. The seats of Higgins and
Or where you live, I think, at the moment, isn't that right?
no, I'm in the seat of Melbourne, held by a Greens candidate, Mr. Adam
Mr.
Bant. Yeah,
Right.
and you'd be in the seat of Higgins.
I think I'm in Kooyong.
Kooyong, even worse. Mr. Josh Frydenberg.
Yes, I met Mr. Frydenberg. You were there?
I was there. I met him too.
Yes, a lovely young chap. Moving on.
All right. Now, the strengths of budgetary policy, obviously the way that it can target different sectors of the economy.
Key strengths.
And it can have immediate impact at times. And what they're hoping is that this tax cut for small business might have a quick impact.
Yeah. And if you get a question on strengths and weaknesses, often, I know we haven't done monetary policy yet, but it is good to be able to sort of refer to monetary policy. And obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, but one of the key things about monetary policy is a very blunt policy tool. You know, if you looked at the GDP data that came out yesterday, some states are doing quite well, New South Wales, Victoria. Other states are doing really poorly, such as Western Australia. Tassie's not doing great either. So consequently, you know, the budget, you could argue, could target specific spending in those states that are struggling with growth. It could target key infrastructure spending in Western Australia. I know, so I think one of the ministers was in Tassie announcing some infrastructure spending down there recently because for that reason. So the budget has the capacity to target particular areas that might be weak, whereas monetary policy is a very blunt policy tool. Example is structural unemployment with the PATH program. There's some good examples there. The housing crisis, you know, if the opposition were elected, their policies that they would put through in a budget would be an attempt to try and deal with some of the higher housing prices we're seeing here.
Yeah, through their negative gearing policy, which tries to, again, remove that as a tax dodge and not a tax dodge, that's incorrect, but a tax minimisation scheme, which they believe would make housing more affordable.
Would upset your Frankston property, wouldn't it?
No, it wouldn't. They wouldn't be retrospectively done, those laws. So my Frankston property's going from strength to strength.
You and there, Mr. Turnbull there in his $1 million mansion.
As Alan Kohler reported last night when he talked about house prices in both New South Wales, or Sydney and Melbourne particularly. They're on the march. So they have been for quite some time. So that's it. Budgetary policy. If you prepare for this, students, you will be in good shape. There are no huge surprises in terms of what we're going to assess. There is a lot of information just been put up on Connect for this week. So good luck, and we will be there on Tuesday for the extra session should you need it.
And remember, students, there's only one. It's up to you. We can provide you with the information. We're happy to support and help you with concepts you don't understand, but you have to learn it. You have to learn it. It's your work, and there's nothing that will replace effort and hard work and sitting down with the notes, being organised and learning the material and understanding and working through those relationships. So good luck.
Yep.
And we'll see you next time.
See you for monetary policy. Mr. Burns' favourite.
I love a bit of monetary policy.
He might do that video on his own.
Oh, I doubt
he can argue with himself. Hooroo, students.